I love being a software engineer because of how easy it is to build side projects. And I've built countless side projects. I've built a social gambling application, a dating website backend that had 0 users, a stock trading music rhythm application for Android. And I think every developer should have side projects. So when I have a web app that I want to deploy and share, I want to show my friends my most recent project that nobody will care about, I use DigitalOcean to quickly spin up a server and host my projects. And who knows, if one day one of my apps takes off and goes viral and people actually do care, I can easily scale using DigitalOcean's flexible pricing plan. Companies like TaskRabbit that have grown rapidly have used DigitalOcean for this very reason. But until this happens, I will happily stick with the $5 a month plan. Sign up with promo code SEDaily to get a free $10 credit as a listener of our show and start building your apps. We would love to see what listeners build, so send us an email showing us your project. I've also interviewed Moise Uretsky, who is the co-founder of DigitalOcean, and he mentioned that the ease of use and the flexibility is why they built the service in the first place. That DigitalOcean interview is one of my favorite episodes. Moise talks about bleeding in a data center. He says, you don't know how hard it is to do a cloud hosting service until you've bled in a data center. It's really interesting. So speaking of which, let's get on with this episode of Software Engineering Daily. Frank Wiles is the president of the Djangos Software Foundation and is a partner at Revolution Systems, a company that specializes in support, scalability, and development using open source software. Frank, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hey, thanks a lot.
You are from Lawrence, Kansas, which is where Django came from. And we wouldn't typically think of that as a place where a widely adopted web framework would come from. Can you tell the story of how Django evolved from a newspaper office in Lawrence, Kansas?
Sure. So you'd be surprised at how many open source people came from the Midwest and ended up moving out to kind of the tech centers of the world for jobs as open source became popular. When I started with the World Company, which was the company that created and released Django, we were running a cable modem operation for the city of Lawrence, which was the second city in the U.S. to have cable modems. And we were always under fairly serious budget constraints. So trying to use commercial Unix, trying to use Microsoft Exchange or something like that to provide email for 20, 30,000 people just wasn't possible to do, right, and be profitable. So we were early adopters of open source. So when we started getting into web development for the newspaper and other kind of technological aspects to the company as things moved along, we pushed more and more open source into the business because we preferred to use it and it was cheaper, and so it was an easy sell. And so when we came up with something internally that we thought worked really well, open sourcing it was not as foreign of a concept to that company as it might have been for other companies.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give a little more color about Django and talk about how your career evolved relative to the evolution of Django?
So it's actually kind of funny. When Django was being used, I had stopped being primarily involved with putting the newspaper online, which was the part of the company where Django was coming from. I was a Perl developer. And I thought Python was fine. I didn't particularly have a problem with it. I just didn't, at that point, Perl was what you used for web development, or maybe PHP. But at that point in time, you didn't use Python for web development. It just wasn't really done. And so when the guys were building something with Python, I just kind of, wasn't that interested in it. But when they wanted to open source it, I was all for that because there's no reason to not open source it, in my opinion. Yeah. So I helped argue to get it open sourced and kind of, I spoke suit better than everybody else. And I could, go back and forth with the lawyer on what license and why. And so fast forward a few years and I leave the company to start doing Perl and Postgres consulting. end up sharing an office with Jacob Kaplan Moss, who was working at that point for a different company when when the Django Software Foundation was formed. And so I got asked to write a little article for Linux Pro Magazine about Django and the Django Software Foundation, which needed to have a kind of quick intro to Django. So I was like, oh, crap, now I got to learn Python and Django real quick so I can write this article and then interview my friend and office mate. So after I did that, I was like, wow, I really like Python and Django. This is really so much better than the tools I'm using in the Perl world. When he decided to leave the company that he was working for, I lobbied very hard to get him to join forces with me and turn RevSys into, Django focused as opposed to Perl focused.
Okay.
So it's funny that, this meeting years ago where I didn't, have a particularly big stake in to get Django open source ended up being the focus of my career.
Yeah, it's funny how those things turn out.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Django in more detail. What is your elevator pitch for what Django is?
The quick, easy answer for any type of web framework, and Django follows this same kind of deal, is it makes it easier and faster to build something and get it out there, get it working and get it out there. A lot of frameworks, however, end up getting in your way, and you have to throw everything away and start over as you scale, for example. Django is really great in that you can replace bits and pieces as you go with faster bits and pieces if necessary, without having to throw everything away and start over. So it's great for prototyping something together, and it makes it, it's a very smooth path to ridiculous scale without a lot of, okay, we've got to just stop using Python and Django and start using Go or something like that, right? There's a very smooth path from small, I just did this in my basement for fun, to Instagram. There's a pretty easy path there if you know what you're doing and you replace certain slower aspects with a little bit faster code here and there. You can get a lot of mileage out of it without having to ever kind of stop what you're doing and do a rewrite.
So you're talking about this interesting kind of gradient of trade-offs between Django and other frameworks, maybe on the axis of scalability and prototypability and other things. On Software Engineering Daily, we've done some shows about Ruby on Rails. We've done some shows about JavaScript frameworks. We haven't done any shows about Django. It sounds like the idea that you're discussing of this scalability is almost independent of the idea of Django as a framework that is coupled to Python. So maybe you can tell me whether this is true, and you can describe some components of the Django framework and how they compare to these other frameworks that have maybe less scalability.
Sure. It's not because it's not independent of Python. Python is definitely, necessary. It would be hard to scale Rails without being able to scale Ruby to some degree, right? What I was trying to say there was that, with a lot of web frameworks, if you decide, I don't like their authentication piece, I need to replace it with a different authentication piece, you have to replace the whole framework. Right? Or if you decide, I don't want to use their template system, I have to use a different framework. Or I don't want to use their ORM, I have to throw everything else away and use a whole different framework to get this other ORM for whatever piece. With Django, you can replace almost all of Django, each bit independently, and still keep the other bits. So in one of the more recent versions of Django, we now support pluggable template engines. So you don't have to use Django templates with Django. You can use different template engines. You lose some support of third-party apps, but it's possible to do and might be useful at scale.
Some of the listeners are new programmers, and they may be looking to get started with their first web application. Maybe they've just written a Hello World application on the console, and they want to get started with web development. What are the trade-offs for a new programmer in the onboarding process? Like if they're getting started with their first web app, how does that compare? If they use Django versus something like Rails or Express, or for the very early beginner, what should they be assessing?
I think for a beginner, it almost doesn't matter which framework they use as long as they use a framework. They're being thrown in the deep end, right? It's not just about the language or the framework. It's about understanding HTTP and CSS and cookies and HTML. There's so many things. I think that's one of the problems with kind of learning to be a developer these days is hello world is complicated, right? It used to be that hello world was literally print hello world in almost every language. Now it's print, what's this left bracket HTML thing?
Yeah, right? or make a to-do list.
Right, that's the to-do list app. And it's like, okay, now I've got databases involved and maybe some SQL, or what's a table and why are they talking about this key thing? And yeah, there's just so many things. It's got to be very frustrating I'm glad I came up into development when I did. So, I think all of those, Rails, Express, Django, those specifically, I think any of those are a decent choice for somebody to pick these days. I think that if you're looking for employment, Rails and Django would probably be a better option for kind of smooth path to job than Express, just in terms of demand out there. But I think that the fact that Python is useful on its own much more outside of web development makes the Python Django combination more appealing, right? No, there's not a lot of hardcore data science happening with Ruby, right?
That's absolutely true.
You know what I mean? Nobody's doing natural language processing work with, Node.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, I think it's partly because Python came to web development late. Python was really, already heavily used in scientific computing because it's a very easy and approachable language. There's a reason that so many places are using Python as their first language at CS schools, because the syntax doesn't get in the way of your understanding of programming concepts.
So are you suggesting that Ruby, for example, maybe the language itself got perturbed by the fact that there was a popular web framework?
No, I don't mean that. I mean that just, code versus code for a simple command line application, people tend to understand the Python faster, just the syntax, faster than Rails or JavaScript or Perl or anything else, right?
Right.
Just the syntax is, people joke that Python is executable pseudocode, right? You're just saying like, oh, do this thing and then print this and add these two things. And Rails is, Ruby is not far off. It's not, it's not assembly or something, COBOL, something very foreign to people. It's closer than a lot of languages have been in the past. It's just that Python was that little bit closer and started to be used in scientific computing before, people were into web development that much. And so it had a foothold there. And linguists wanted to do stuff with, computing. And so they were starting to do things in languages like Perl and Python, because they weren't programmers by trade. They didn't want to do things in C and Java, right? So they were looking for an easier language to work with, and the performance of those weren't as crucial, right? I could run my linguistics test on my desktop computer at work and then go home for the night, and if it was done by the time I got home, cool, right? It didn't, the performance wasn't as crucial. So those things already had this foothold in this huge community. And then Django came along and web development started to get popular. And, then so you have the best of kind of all worlds, where Ruby really got popular because of Rails.
Right. It's funny how these different languages and paradigms build compound interest based on the types of groups that are using them. So yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, my first web applications were written in Rails, and more recently I'm doing full stack JavaScript stuff, and I find that some of the things that Rails took care of for me have to be handled more explicitly in Express.js. And I haven't written any big Django applications, but as I read about Django, it sounds like the requirement to be explicit, like that idea that I'm having to tackle in writing full stack JavaScript stuff, that's like having to know what's going on in terms of routing, for example, or middleware. So that's more stressed in full stack JavaScript, and my impression is that that's the case in Django also, like more so than Rails. This overarching need to understand what is going on a little better and to be more explicit about things. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's mostly accurate. I think the difference between a kind of all-encompassing framework like Django or Rails and something more like Express. Express is closer to something like in the Python world like Flask. It provides these aspects of web development for you, and then you're expected to use other libraries as you see fit, and kind of piece together your own system. And that's one way people like to build things. That's very common to how we built things with Perl and early web development. Like, I like this database library, and I like this template engine, and I want to use this email library, and I stitch them together with a little bit of my own code, and we're off to the races. And the JavaScript world is still kind of going through that. It seems like every couple of weeks there's a different Gulp Webpack something coming out that's the new current awesome, right? And I think that community is still kind of, narrowing down their choices to, the 2 or 3 best versions. I think that the difference between Rails and Django is a little more subtle. Django gives you really great defaults for kind of your average web application out of the box. Your new user doesn't even need to know that middleware exists, right, to get their job done. They need to understand that middleware exists, when they go to turn on authentication or something like that. But it's easy to trace from here comes my web request through my middleware. This makes sense how this works. There's no magic there. And I think that it's really hard to trace through a Rails app and not get sidetracked by, like, I don't understand why this does that. Like, there's no, anytime I get confused about Django, even when I was first learning Django and Python, I could open up the source to Django and go, oh, I see what they're doing there. Okay, that makes sense. And move right along. I don't think that that's true in a Rails world.
So, you mentioned Flask. How does Django compare to the other Python frameworks like Flask? There's also pylons.
Mm-hmm. There's several. There's Bottle, there's Falcon, there's all sorts of little micro frameworks. There's a lot of them. In terms of market and mind share, Django wins, 75+% of the Python world when it comes to, just like Rails dominates in a Ruby world, and Express dominates in a JavaScript world, right? There are others. People use them for different purposes. A lot of times, the reason somebody picks Flask, for example, is that they don't want to have to. They don't want to feel overwhelmed by all the options that Django brings. They have a very small feature set that they want to implement, and they want to understand that explicitness, and they want to have less of that to explore. And sometimes it's for performance. I wrote an article this time last year about, at what point do you have to get rid of Python, right? What level of scale? And it turned out that, if I replaced Python with PyPy and I replaced Django with Falcon, I could get a ridiculous amount of performance and still be doing Python, right? And so there are aspects, if I was working on, a system like, what would be a good example, like Twilio, you're receiving tons and tons of API requests. Django might not be the best system for that. It wouldn't be a bad choice. It just may not be the most performant, fastest choice. And if part of your app's need is, to turn that request around as fast as possible to not have much delay on the phone side of things, then you might not want to use Python. You might not want to use Django. But for most every scenario, it's fine.
Engineers are always looking to simplify. To simplify testing and deployment, engineers turn to CodeShip. CodeShip is continuous integration and delivery as a service. With CodeShip, your tests are executed against your code automatically whenever you push to GitHub or Bitbucket. On Software Engineering Daily, we've done several shows about DevOps, and continuous deployment is key to DevOps. It's a great way to break down the wall of confusion between development and operations. Managing your own testing infrastructure is painful. That's why you want a service like CodeShip to do it for you. If you have a huge number of tests, you can use CodeShip's Parallel CI to run all your tests in parallel. CodeShip will spin up containers on their own infrastructure to run your tests in parallel. If the code passes your tests, CodeShip will deploy it automatically to your users. Companies like Product Hunt are already using CodeShip to speed up and simplify development. To sign up for free and start shipping today, go to codeship.com. Or to try out CodeShip's new Docker platform, go to codeship.com/Docker. So I want to get to talking about some other Python stuff eventually, but we have some listener questions about Django and Python. Mm-hmm. And these questions were taken from the Software Engineering Daily Slack channel. So if anybody is curious, they can join on the website, softwareengineeringdaily.com, and can ask questions for similar shows. So the first question is from Srinify. He asks, what is Django's philosophy on asynchronous or event-based programming?
So this has been one of those things that Django has not done a particularly amazing job at. There are ways to do it, typically involving a Python system called Celery and using event-driven WSGI processes like gEvent. So the idea is that, a request comes in, you fire off a task into an async pool, workers do the work, and then the results are returned, right? There's actually the Mozilla Foundation just granted Django $150,000, I believe, dollars towards Andrew Godwin, who's one of the core contributors to Django, to build a system and rebuild basically some of the internals of Django to support a very async flow. The concept revolves around channels. There's some information online. I don't have the link handy, but if you search for Django channels, you should be able to find Andrew talking about the ideas around what he's going to do to Django's internals to make that more of a kind of first-class citizen in the Django world.
Very interesting. So Srinify also asks, what architectural decisions would you make differently if Django were started today?
That's interesting. So, one of the harder things about open source code as it gets popular is the kind of long-term maintainability issues, backwards compatibility issues. If I was overlord of the Django ecosystem, there is definitely some aspects of how the template system works that I would change. For example, the original guys who worked on Django were PHP developers. And so all of the date-time string formatting is not kind of standard strf time. It's PHP's string formatting. And that has been just kept through, and it's the one thing about Django that is PHP-like, and it's very out of place with the rest of everything. So that's one small kind of personal annoyance. The other main thing, I guess, that I would have done differently is around, and this is a personal thing mostly. It's I would have had more of a focus on the enterprise than the beginner. But I think that for the health of the project and the popularity of the project, they made the right decision. That's what I would have done differently, and I probably wouldn't be in charge of a foundation around that project because nobody would have used it. I would have been more concerned about performance, too concerned about performance. So, I might not be the best person to start a new project like that because I'm such a performance nerd.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So another listener from the Slack room is Tobias Macy, who is the host of podcast.init, which is a show about Python. So Tobias asks, how will HTTP2 affect the WSGI standard, and how does Django plan to adapt to newer web standards?
I think that a lot of adapting to a web standard is typically more about individual developers and projects, taking on that. There's not much tends to change about HTTP itself. In this case, he's talking about HTTP2, and so things do change. I don't really see those as huge barriers, right? We've had a lot of change over the 10 years of Django, and JavaScript went from being something very small in your stack to being something very large in your stack. We went from Python 2 to Python 3. There's been some really huge changes, and Django has gone through them very, very easily, honestly. So I don't foresee any problems. I think that it's more of a Django and the community will respond to that change at the same speed, or maybe even a little faster than everyone else online, right? As it becomes popular with users and browsers and is supported everywhere, I think that you will see, Django start moving towards supporting those features in cleaner, easier ways.
Yep, definitely. So let's gradually shift our conversation. You're the president of the Django Software Foundation. What are the goals of the Django Software Foundation? So
the main purpose of the Software Foundation is to hold the intellectual property of Django, right? To hold the copyright, hold the trademark, and support the Django community. Some ways that's happened early on was just simple things like, giving some money to support a meetup in a particular town on a particular day. Buy the pizza for a hack day. Things like that. Help, core members of a Python community, of the Django community, get to a particular conference. Perhaps they live in another country and it's difficult for them to get here to present their important information at DjangoCon. Maybe the DSF helps cover their airfare or something. Recently, in the last couple of years, though, there's been more of an emphasis on helping kind of Django itself a little more directly. They've brought on a fundraising manager, and they've been raising a lot more money and have been paying actually part-time and full-time developers to work on Django specifically. And that's been actually really successful.
Are there any interesting problems in managing that?
I think that, I haven't been directly involved, so I'm hearing things secondhand on that. I think, honestly, the biggest problem is the community perception of it. I think that there are a lot of people in the open source world that thinks the minute you mix money and open source, it all goes to shit. And I just don't think that's true. I think that, Red Hat is doing, as good a work today as it was doing when it barely made money.
Yeah, and Red Hat is like the base case for this entire gigantic industry of other companies following in similar models like Cloudera, Rokana, Confluent. Isn't
Atlassian. There's so many places that
Atlassian isn't NPM is even a company, right?
Yeah, now, yeah. And like my company, RevSys, we make all of our money off of open source, not selling it directly to anyone, but off the sidelines of open source. And I don't think that any of those things have corrupted open source anyway. Does the possibility exist that those things could? Sure. Could it be a waste of money? I could see situations where, maybe you end up just paying a hotshot developer to work on stuff and he maybe doesn't get anything done. That's not the case with what the DSF is doing, but I mean, I can see people's concern. I just don't think it's a very founded concern.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's talk more about Revolution Systems, or as you've called it, RevSys. So one of your specialties is Django consulting. Tell me about a Django problem that someone came to you with recently that required a nuanced understanding of Django to solve.
It's actually a fairly common problem for us, and that is you're a company with 10 or more developers, and you are using another stack, or you're using a hodgepodge of 5 or 6 stacks with different legacy issues. And you've decided as a company that you've looked at the landscape, you've looked at Rails, you've looked at Node, you've looked at PHP frameworks, and you've decided that Python and Django is the way that you want to go, and you're going to standardize on that going forward. Making that transition as a organization is difficult. And so a lot of times, a lot of what we're doing is, okay, well, which piece is both a good first project for these guys that can show off Django, kind of sell the team on that they did make the right decision, but is complicated enough they don't feel like it's a hello world project. Which of their pieces of infrastructure, their current system, can we replace with Django first? And then, here's the path to replacing the other pieces, and hold their hand while they go through that for the first 3-6 months of that transition.
What is a common way in which you see companies architecting their Django applications suboptimally?
Well, a lot of times it's not even necessarily a Django thing. It's a legacy mindset, right? They write Python like it's Java. They look and worry about tooling and problems that existed in their own old ecosystem that just simply don't exist in the new ecosystem that they're in. And then and this is, I think, true in almost no matter what, people tend to want to design their own databases, their own schemas, and they don't do a particularly good job at it. They think they are, but they don't actually do a particularly good job at it. And so they want to wrestle away from doing it the Django way. And they want to name their own tables. They want to name the fields specifically because that's what they've done in their previous projects. And it's just simply not a big issue in Django, and they think it is, and they think that this was like the one thing they didn't like about Django, and it's just a waste of their time and is counterproductive. And it's very hard sometimes to convince somebody that it really doesn't matter what the name of that table is.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll talk about DevOps a little bit eventually, but this sounds like you're saying there are cultural shifts that people need to make, or maybe it's not cultural as much as behavioral shifts.
Yeah. So, I mean, like if, when I'm, the problems I need to worry about when I am walking a street in Somalia are much different than the problems I need to worry about when I'm walking the street in Fargo, North Dakota. Right?
Yeah.
And so when I've totally changed my environment to be worried about IEDs going off in Fargo is silly, really. It's really silly. And I can understand, you were just in a war zone and you had these particular problems. Now you're in a different place, and your biggest problem is there's no in and out, or there's other problems. I'm not saying that that Django has no problems. There are challenges you will face, but people hold on to those old challenges because that's what they know and they're used to. And it's a very common human concept, right? But it doesn't matter, and they spend a lot of time trying to having to be convinced that those things are not really issues, and that I swear you're not, even at scale, that's not going to matter. Trust, I've been there. This just doesn't matter, and they don't. They think they know better, and that's fine. Like I said, it's a very normal human nature to kind of cling on to old patterns. That's why quitting smoking is hard, or if you're an addict of any kind, like the patterns of where and when and all that stuff. I go to the same place for coffee every morning, and it's weird when I travel and I don't get to go to that same coffee shop. And I get that it's uncomfortable, but you have to realize you've totally changed countries, and the laws are different, and some things matter and some things don't.
Yeah. And I mean, you talked about this some in a talk about DevOps that you gave, although you were talking about DevOps. I think that this applies in this situation when you get people who can be extremely rigid or dogmatic about certain things just because they're used to a certain paradigm. And so, you said be spiritual, not a fundamentalist.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's broadly applicable. But
we sometimes my business partner and I talk about the difference between agile is good, but we talk about little a agile, not big A agile. Where big A agile is you have the manifesto taped to the side of your monitor, and this doesn't fit one of these rules. It's kind of like the people who argue that parking violations aren't in the Constitution, so they're not legal. It's okay, you don't really know what you're talking about, but you only believe what's in the Constitution, okay? But don't be so rigid in your kind of methodologies and beliefs in whatever ecosystem you're in. Everybody's got to be a little bit flexible, because just that rigidity doesn't work. The only thing that we do as technologists that is rigid is that the compiler is not going to take a syntax error. There's very little else that needs to really be rigid. And, I would prefer if everybody's, over the wire protocols were rigid about, what they sent and received. But we live in the real world and it's not going to happen, so I don't stress about it.
Yeah, well, it is nice in software that we do have those certain things, certain rules that we are bound by, protocols, compilers, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
These things are immutable, so we can mutate everything else.
Yeah.
So before we get to talking about the more fungible aspects of this conversation, like DevOps, you mentioned scalability a bit. What are the scalability bottlenecks that people often encounter in Django applications? Does this come back to this cultural or behavioral discussion, or are there actual like Rails, for example? So I you hear people say Ruby on Rails doesn't scale, and they refer to Twitter moving away from Rails. And as I understand, this was due to problems with the ORM not being a good interface between application logic and data. So I'm curious if there's any things you can pinpoint about scalability that happen in Django applications.
So it's always going to be your data store. And it doesn't matter if it's Rails, PHP, whatever, your slowness is going to be your data store, right? And the safety around your data store. So if you're using a Postgres or MySQL database, you're trading off some performance for safety and for a particular way of accessing your data. I would argue that Twitter moving away from Rails was not so much about Twitter removing the ORM of the active record ORM as it was their ridiculous growth and their data input patterns and access patterns lended itself to using Cassandra and other NoSQL stores, more than it did using a relational store. And so at that point, you lose a lot of what makes Rails useful if you're not going to be using active record, using Rails. I don't think that's why they got rid of Rails. It was because the ORM was slow. It was that they couldn't use, a relational database to hold their data anymore in a sane way. And I think that happens in one form or another to everyone who scales ridiculously large.
Yeah.
Right. When you do a Google search, they are not doing select star from all web pages where, you don't know that. I would bet a lot of money that is not what's happening. But the
limit 10.
Yeah, limit 10. Yeah. And, a lot of what people they focus in on parts that they can more easily change. I think is one of the problems people have in scaling in general, as opposed to what is going to make the most impact. So they worry, I hear that Node is 10% faster than Python, so I'm going to move everything to Node. And what they find is that they're still using the same data store. And so their request, which was taking 100 milliseconds before, is now taking 93 milliseconds, and no one cares that it's 7 milliseconds faster, because what they didn't look at was the fact that 92 milliseconds of that 100 milliseconds was in the database. Right? So they're worrying about the wrong parts. They're worrying about parts that they find interesting to change and not the parts that really matter. People, the whole concept around, in scalability and performance is do less work. That's the only thing you can do, right? At the very core of what we're doing here, we're limited by physics, right? You can get a little faster processor and you can get a little faster network, and those things help, absolutely. But, at the end of the day, the only way you can do an operation truly faster is to do less steps in it, do less work, or move work out of the request response cycle. So for things like leaderboards, people want we need to have up to the minute accurate data. No, you don't. Even something as simple as caching it for 10 seconds, right, can take away a ton of work in your system. And no one is going to notice 10 seconds of caching, right? I scored some new points. Why didn't I move from fourth to third? Refresh the page. The cache is already busted and it's there now. And no one's going to notice that sort of level of caching, but that can reduce infrastructure costs, huge, tons and tons and tons of money at scale.
Right. Yeah, I remember learning. I took the software engineering class in college, and one of the first things we learned was just the importance of caching, and then it was just reiterated and beaten into our heads in that software engineering class.
And people still don't do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's an interesting concept. So at RevSys, what have you learned about managing software projects?
Oh, well, that's one of those things that I don't think it's like a book. You're never really done. Every project is a little different, because you have different humans involved. And I think that one thing that programmers and software developers don't focus enough on that they should, if they really want to get better at their craft, it's not always about learning the next new technical thing and knowing everything about their framework without having to reference the documentation. I'm the president of the Django Software Foundation, and I read the Django docs every single day. Every single day. I don't have all that stuff memorized. There's just no point. But what I do focus on is understanding people and communication. That will boost your career so much that it's not even funny. Being better at communicating what you're wanting to do and why you think your idea is better. Being able to realize, I think this is what they mean, but before I go spend 2 days writing the code, I'm going to go and have a quick conversation with them and make sure I understand exactly what they want. setting expectations and giving people, status reports. Just because you committed something to GitHub and that they could go look and see that there was a commit doesn't necessarily mean they did. And they still may be going, well, where is Bob on that project? I have no idea what's going on. I wish he would tell me something,
Are there any communication anti-patterns that you see programmers, chronically engaging in that they could amend?
Yeah, I think that I had a boss years ago that gave me a bit of advice, and I try to do it, and is that you should never say no. If you're working at a company and somebody comes in and says, we need to add OAuth support to this, and you just, no. It may be a horrible idea. It may be technologically infeasible, and complicated. You could say, well, we could do that, but programmers have a really bad reputation of being naysayers, and we shouldn't do that. That'll never work. It'll never scale. No. Be a little more, we could do that, but it's going to cost you $1 million. Then let them decide, is it worth it to them? Because a lot of times we, developers are down in the trenches and don't understand the business aspects at play. And it may be that it looks ridiculous to us to spend $1 million to get that thing, but it brings in a $10 million contract. And now all of a sudden that's a no-brainer. And so asking why somebody wants something is important as well, right? Understanding the motivation of why you're working on this particular ticket is, if for no other reason, gives you something to talk about when you go home and your family says, what did you do last week? Oh, well, I really saved this, contract, or I helped our biggest customer do this thing they've been wanting to do for a really long time, not I added OAuth 2 support to an API.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I think, this emphasis on communication dovetails nicely into talking about DevOps. You gave a talk several months ago about how to get to DevOps Nirvana. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what an organization looks like once it achieves DevOps Nirvana?
It's that there is very little friction between I've written some code to it's being tested. Stakeholders are playing with it in a staging environment to it's in production. There's no one's getting woken up in the middle of the night on a regular basis because of problems. Outages are rare. Alerts are rare. Alerts that wake you up are even rarer. That flows seamlessly, seems effortless. It's the difference between when I pretend to be a ninja at Halloween versus looking at a Shaolin monk doing kung fu, right? Mm. I look funny and, silly pretending to be a ninja, and a Shaolin monk makes it look effortless.
Right.
Work has been done and it's perfected in a way that it just everything moves very smoothly.
So, and in terms of how you actually get there, mm-hmm. there's, you had some tactics that made a lot of sense to me. You had a slide where you emphasized the need to apply a, quote, metrics mentality to everything. Mm-hmm. So in your work at RevSys or perhaps elsewhere, how have you applied a metrics mentality to I don't know, maybe you have something that wasn't an obvious target for metrics-driven analysis?
I've done a bit of work in this. So this tends to be stuff that we do with a client more than of ourselves, because each of our projects is so different. If I worked for Twitter, there would be a very kind of set level of metrics of what we wanted to be able to see and things we look at, and that wouldn't change much. But a lot of times our projects are 1 month long, and so we're encouraging a customer to implement these particular metrics because we think that will show them interesting information. One thing that I've done is I look at that there was a surprising number, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I'd have to go look them up, but is new client inquiries to us versus the number of times I tweet. Not even about what I tweet, just the number of times, right? Which I found interesting. It was not so much that I was giving out amazing technological insight. I could be talking about my kids, or today I tweeted out about, how it's warm here in Kansas, for unseasonably warm for it being December. The more I tweeted, the more sales calls we got, which I found very interesting. And that's not a metric that I think that I would have thought to correlate together.
Yeah, same here. I mean, maybe Software Engineering Daily should start tweeting more.
Yeah.
We only tweet about episodes because I'm just I don't ever want anybody to unfollow us for tweeting too much.
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't tweet enough.
Exactly. And so that's one of those things that I was kind of under the same, I don't want to annoy him, but I need to have something important to say. Right. And then, then I would realize that there's this guy I follow, and he's got 3.5 million followers, and he just tweeted about what he had for lunch. And I'm just like, huh. And it's the thing with Twitter, I think a lot of developers treat it like it's RSS, and it's not. I pull out my Twitter client and I scan through it a couple times a day, depending on what's going on, and look for something interesting. And I don't try to catch up to every tweet that's gone through my feed over the last 72 hours because I unplugged. I just look at the last couple of pages till I get bored, and then I go on and do something else. So the fact that that person's name popped up at all, be like, hey, why do I follow him? And you look, oh yeah, he's the guy that did blah. Let me see what else he's tweeted about recently. And I think it drives just kind of, it's touch points. It's number of times of engagement. Marketers talk about how a lot of times with brands that you have to see the brand 3 or 4 times before you engage with it, before you consider it a trusted brand. No matter how good that first ad is, you won't just go buy their thing until you've seen it elsewhere mentioned a couple of times. And I think the same thing is kind of true about kind of personal brands.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting that this idea of a metrics mentality can lead to surfacing aspects of your organization that you didn't know would exist. And I think another dimension of getting to this metrics mentality in practice is logging properly. And you mentioned logging in your discussion. Logging is really important to a healthy DevOps environment. What are some best practices around logging, especially in a scaling organization?
So, I think one thing is that it's beneficial to use structured logging. So that you're not just, it's not just a string of text and a timestamp, that it's, say like a JSON document that has several pieces of information to it. Which user was doing this, the timestamp, obviously, what system did it come from? If you're in AWS, what availability zone did that request originate in? And, whatever information you can shove in there that's kind of ancillary to the new user signed up piece that is the heart of that log message. That's always a good thing to have. You almost can't log too much information. Sure, at a Twitter scale or a Facebook scale, you probably end up paring back information simply for storage and processing reasons, right? But as you get started, storing logs is cheap. Right? If you generate 10 gigs a day, at the end of the year, you're paying $400 a month in S3 costs. And that assumes you're not compressing them. Yeah. Right? For an organization, that's nothing. Yeah. It's not, the logs should be built in a way that you have to use software to consume them. I think a lot of times, especially me and old school people, we're used to that's a lot of information to scroll by when I tail that file. But you're not tailing that file anymore, right? You're pushing it off into a system, and you can slice and dice and query. And the more information you have, the better. And the ability to go back and process old logs to see if an assumption is true is often useful. What would have happened had we, changed this 9 months ago? Let's run through the logs and look for the relevant pieces, and how often would that have happened? A lot of times, we were talking about it in organizations and metrics, and I've made some comments in the past about like, yeah, you should track, your coffee consumption, and was it decaf or, French press? And I say that mostly jokingly that, that's a little bit too much detail. But if you have that kind of level of information, you can go back and say, we've got this policy that's maybe an HR policy, but how many times did we actually end up having to enforce it last year? Maybe we don't need that policy anymore. Right. Like,
the importance of being able to do a retrospective.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't have enough information, you're just guessing again, right? Like we have to guess about the future. We shouldn't have to guess about what would have happened in the past, right?
Yeah, that's very true. So I know our time draws near. So do you have anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners? Yeah,
so we're currently actually working on a new product that's actually about logging. It's called Spectrum. You can sign up for the early access to the beta at devspectrum.com. It's DEV spectrum.com. What it is there's all these great tools for looking at logging once you're in production. There's the ELK stack, there's services like Loggly, there's CloudWatch, there's all these different things that are great for slicing and dicing your logs from production, but there's really nothing for the developer. All right, the best we have is like tailing a file. So Spectrum is a app that you run locally that you can fire your logs into that lets you show and hide logs and filter logs, much like you would with a SaaS product or the ELK stack, but doesn't have any emphasis on storage and retention. It's really about the code I'm working on right now, this one development iteration. And we found it to be really useful to both make our development go faster and find bugs faster, but also to have all that proper logging already set up for when you do go to production.
Well, that's great. Well, we will put it in the show notes. And thanks for coming on, Frank Wiles. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks for having me.